And this is our last part of our Jewish American experience, pretty much tour of the United States, visiting different museums. I'm happy a lot of people are enjoying this. I hope to have more. And we're here to talk about the Upper Midwest, where there's a bunch of Jewry as well, and she has some history that connects to us. And Kate is an archivist, and she is also a board member of the Historical Society. And so we welcome Kate here. She's going to screen share now. Thank you.
All right, great. Everyone can see my slides. We're good. All right, so thank you so much for having me here this afternoon. I always look forward to meeting other people who are interested in Jewish American history. My name is Kate Dietrick. I am not only a board member of the Jewish Historical Society of the Upper Midwest, but I'm also an archivist of the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives at the University of Minnesota. And so today I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Jewish Historical Society of the Upper Midwest, how the organization began, how it evolved over time, and how eventually they made the decision to donate all of their archives to the University of Minnesota. And then I'm going to do kind of an overview of local Upper Midwest Jewish history as punctuated by materials that we have in the archives to tell the story. And there should be plenty of time at the end to ask questions. So if you have questions, put them in the chat and I will try to answer them at the end. So the Jewish Historical Society of the Upper Midwest first began to take shape in 1984, initially under the moniker of the Minnesota Jewish Historical Society. This small group of Jewish community members saw a need. They were concerned that the stories of early Jewish settlers in Minnesota were not being saved or told. Here we have the very first newsletter that they released in the spring of 1985. The objectives of the group were at that time listed as 1, to locate and collect materials which may help establish or illustrate the history of Jewish people of Minnesota. 2, to disseminate historical information to interested persons, groups, institutions, and arouse interest in the past by appropriate means. 3, to accomplish these goals through the establishment of clearly defined collection, conservation, and interpretation policies. And 4, to become a catalyst for individuals and institutions to work together to study, research, collect, and preserve the Jewish experience of Minnesota. The newsletter goes on to mention a bit about the background of founding of the group. Community members Sharon Steinfeld, Marilyn Chayet, and Lionel Davis met at the Lincoln Dell, a popular Jewish deli in Minneapolis, and, quote, shared the dream. From the beginning, they turned to staff at the University of Minnesota, in this case it was Rudy Vicoli at the Immigration History Research Center, to provide feedback on the path forward. And then in their charter meeting, it was held at Mount Zion Temple in Minnesota, which is the oldest synagogue in the state. More on them later. Their featured speaker was then executive director of the Minnesota Historical Society. Over the years, the scope and name of the organization would expand to become the Jewish Historical Society of the Upper Midwest, incorporating North and South Dakota into collecting as an acknowledgement of the ties of immigration and movement between these geographical areas. The Jewish Historical Society, under the direction of historian Dr. Linda Mack Schloff, would for a while reside at Hamline University in St. Paul before relocating to the Minneapolis Jewish Community Center. Over the years, they continued collecting archival materials and artifacts. They put on community events, mounted exhibits, and published research that included a historical journal, which you see here. Their archival collections grew as individuals and local organizations donated materials in an effort to preserve this local Jewish history. In 2001, former Minnesota Governor Elmer L. Anderson extended an invitation to the Jewish Historical Society to place parts of the collection at the new library at the University of Minnesota that was bearing his name. Governor Anderson was personal friends with Nathan and Teresa Berman, who were two early influential leaders with the Jewish Historical Society. Seeing as the archival collection was growing in size and popularity, they took him up on the offer. So parts of the collection came to Anderson Library at the University of Minnesota in 2002. And ultimately, in 2012, the decision was made by the board of the Jewish Historical Society to donate the entire collection to the University of Minnesota. In March 2013, I became the first dedicated archivist for the entire collection, which is now known as the Nathan and Teresa Berman Upper Midwest Jewish Archives. The Jewish Historical Society as an organization continues on, but they no longer collect archival material and instead focus on public programming, events, and publications. The Jewish Historical Society and the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives do not share a budget, a staff, or a location. However, our past's intertwined nature and shared goal of telling the story of local Jewish history means that we work together constantly. And as the archivist, I sit on the board. So I wanted to spend just a real quick moment discussing this transition of the Jewish Historical Society choosing to no longer collect archives, because in the 9 years that I've been the archivist, I've had 2 other Jewish historical societies around the country reach out to me asking questions about how and why this partnership and transition happened. Other people, other organizations seem to be looking to a similar partnership. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about this unique part of the group. So, why might the organization that grew the archives over 28 years want to cede everything to a large institution like the University of Minnesota? The Jewish Historical Society had a few reasons for wanting to donate their collections instead of continuing to collect on their own. First, accessibility. The Jewish Historical Society kept their collections in a small, cramped basement in a room at the Minneapolis JCC that was battling leaks. They had limited staff and no reading room with regular hours to provide researchers access to the materials. And so they asked the question, why have a collection if no one can actually use the materials? Supporting the collections had become unsustainable for such a small organization. The University of Minnesota Archives and Special Collections, on the other hand, had a purpose-built library with a purpose-built reading room. All archives and special collections are kept in 2 storage caverns underground with climate control and high security. The materials would be safe with the university, would have space to grow, and would be able to be accessed by researchers far more easily than before. Another reason the Jewish Historical Society was interested in materials coming to the university was visibility. These collections document local Jewish history, and they'd now be situated with other nationally recognized collections at a large research institution. There are 14 different archival collections in Anderson Library. Some, such as the Immigration History Research Center archives and the Social Welfare History archives, are of overlapping interest to those looking to research with the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives. People come to use other collection materials would now be able to find and use local Jewish history as well. Before coming to the university, none of the collections amassed by the Jewish Historical Society had finding aids, and only brief descriptions of materials were available online. Once at the university, collections were processed, finding aids were created, and were then searchable online alongside 2,000 other collections which were already at the university. Materials previously only findable while at the JCC could now be found by researchers across the world. Finally, one big reason that the Jewish Historical Society was interested in pivoting away from collecting archival materials is opportunity. By no longer focusing on acquiring, organizing, and providing access to historical documents, what else could they do? The transition was not approached as a loss, but rather as an opportunity to grow in new directions. When Robin Jorishow became the executive director of the Jewish Historical Society at the end of 2016, she ushered in a new era for the organization with successful exhibits, oral history projects, publications, and community events. And you see that one photo there of a speaker standing at a lectern. That's Ari Shapiro from NPR. He came and gave a presentation to celebrate an anniversary with the Jewish Historical Society. So now I just want to pivot and talk about the history of Jews in the Upper Midwest as punctuated by materials that we have in the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives to illustrate these histories. The Upper Midwest Jewish Archives collects materials related to Jewish communities throughout the areas of Minnesota, North and South Dakota, and Western Wisconsin, which is a diverse group of people that, like many across America, began as an immigrant people to a foreign land, seeking a better life. While Jewish communities in this area grew over the years, as a minority, they never surpassed a double-digit percentage of the total population of the state of Minnesota. Always been a minority. And they faced an uphill battle, as evidenced by the 1946 essay that called out Minneapolis as the capital of anti-Semitism in the United States. Many collections in the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives point to issues that face many minority immigrant communities: setting down roots, building a support system through places of worship or social organizations, finding jobs, starting businesses, while also combating prejudice with social advocacy groups and maintaining integrity and autonomy as generations grow and change in their adopted lands. The Upper Midwest Jewish Archives offers two unique perspectives on the Jewish American experience. This is not the typical Jewish immigrant story you hear of Lower East Side tenements, garment workers. And it's also a unique perspective on the Minnesota immigrant experience, because few, if any, Jews participated in the state's major industries of iron mining or flour milling, and instead they made inroads in other industries. While the settlement of the Upper Midwest is relatively recent history in the grand scheme of American history as a whole, from the offset, Jewish settlers came to the area as soon as Minnesota was established as a territory in 1849. The first wave of Jewish immigrants from the 1840s to 1880s was mostly comprised of German Jews, who were a more well-off immigrant group that was already somewhat established in America, as evidenced by the fact that when they came, they brought with them money to begin various entrepreneurial endeavors. Most were middle-class citizens who lived comfortably among other German immigrants in St. Paul, and they worked as clothing or dry good merchants. The second wave of Jewish immigrants in the 1880s to 1920s were Eastern European, mostly Russian immigrants and refugees, whose social practices, language, and socioeconomic backgrounds kept them somewhat separate from the now more established German Jews. Russian Jews came to America for some different reasons than German Jews. They left Eastern Europe to avoid violent and deadly pogroms, forced enlistment in the Russian army, as well as anti-Semitic laws and poor economic conditions that made their survival difficult. However, both groups, like all immigrants to the United States, had the same economic reasons to try out a new way of life. During the year of 1882, nearly 600 new Jewish refugees settled in Minnesota, which was a number that was nearly equal to that of the older established German Jews already residing in the state. So over 1 year, Jewish population doubles. The numbers only increased as the years went on. By the 1920s, some 30 to 40,000 Jews resided in Minnesota. At the turn of the century, Jewish immigration was booming and only really began to slow after 1924, which is the year that immigration quotas were put in place. One of the oldest collections we have is in the Upper Midwest Jewish Archives is that of the first synagogue in St. Paul, Mount Zion Hebrew Congregation, which is now known as Mount Zion Temple. The synagogue was established in 1856, which is 2 years before Minnesota gained statehood, although it wasn't until 1981 that an actual structure was built for the congregation and a rabbi was hired. This is a picture of their first building, which was located at 10th and Minnesota in kind of the downtown, what we think of as the downtown capital area. Not all Jews in St. Paul joined Mount Zion, but until other congregations arose, all Jews used the Mount Zion Cemetery, as burial in hallowed ground was indeed strictly followed, whether or not you're affiliated. While membership remained strong, so in 1882, the membership did not exceed 50 families, the synagogue spurred social togetherness in the community, providing charitable services, and really began planting the seeds for religious education activities for children. The records that we have date from 1857 to 1986 and include things such as meeting minutes, which I realize might seem dry, not very fun, but perusing them, you come across very interesting things, as seen here in the minutes from March 7th, 1858, where it states that there is a motion to advertise for a shochet with a salary of $300, writing that they'll send a notice to the Israelite for advertising the position. The Israelite is a still running weekly Jewish newspaper in Cincinnati. So here we have in 1858, by looking for someone who is trained in ritual slaughter for food according to Jewish dietary laws, we see the beginning needs of a growing Jewish community who wanted to remain observant despite the possible influences of their new cultural surroundings. On the left, there is a list of members of Mount Zion in 1889, which includes their addresses throughout St. Paul. And it's really interesting to see where people lived. One person came all the way from Stillwater, which is on the border with Wisconsin, which is some 20 miles away, which in 1889, 20 miles, that's a lot. In this collection, we have cemetery bylaws, blueprints of synagogues that were built. We've got high holy day sermons, bar mitzvah speeches, and I find it really interesting. The rabbi held a weekly radio show in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and we have records of the questions and notes from listeners. Synagogues were not the only establishments created to build communities around, and as years went on, leisure pursuits were explored through social clubs, fraternal organizations, and community centers. Another great collection we have is the St. Paul Jewish Community Center records. Opened in 1930 under the name Jewish Educational Center, they aimed to help poor immigrants with classes in English and homemaking, along with purely social activities for all ages. The St. Paul JCC records that we have span the years 1912 to the present and include everything from information on programs and events throughout the years to summer camps to the Jewish Community Center Symphony Orchestra, which is the oldest community symphony in the country, and they are still performing. We have meeting minutes, photographs, scrapbook pages, newspaper clippings. We've got a lot of rich material that tell the history of the community. Although Minneapolis and St. Paul certainly housed the largest overall population of Jews in the upper Midwest, the Twin Cities were not the only place where Jewish settlers went to. Cities such as Faribault, Mankato, Austin, Albert Lea, all had Jewish families as well. Also, Jewish homesteads throughout the Dakotas popped up through the late 1800s and early 1900s. One of our most used collections is the Jewish Historical Project of North Dakota Records. This collection was put together by a woman named 𝘑𝘩𝘕 𝑔𝑒ller in the late 1970s, and she had planned to publish a book on Jewish settlement in North Dakota. Her research began in this really DIY way. She essentially just started writing letters to Jewish families that she knew across the state, and she urged them to share their stories of homesteading. 𝘑𝘩𝘕 𝑔𝑒ller collected numerous stories from Jewish settlers in North Dakota. Unfortunately, she passed away suddenly in 1978, and her book was never realized. But what remains is her research, letters upon letters from hundreds of families detailing rough winters, crop failures, and homesteads working together to cultivate a land that in the end simply was not suitable for farming. The Jewish immigrants who arrived in North Dakota were essentially the same as Minnesota immigrants. First, it was German Jews who had the capital to buy large tracts of land and establish businesses. And then later, Eastern European Jews were drawn to the area by the promise of free land. Because during this time, in certain parts of Eastern Europe, Jews could not own land. But in North Dakota, under the Homestead Act of 1862, you could get 160 acres of land. And if you worked that land for 5 years and improved it, you could then get that land for free. And this lure brought in nearly 1,000 Jewish settlers to North Dakota during this first half century of settlement. As more and more Eastern European Jews flooded into New York and Chicago, even St. Paul, there were Jewish charities that worried about space and jobs for the incoming population. So many Jewish social welfare groups and synagogues provided financial support for Jewish immigrants wishing to homestead in the Dakotas. Settlements in Painted Woods and Devil's Lake were established solely for Jewish homesteaders. Most families, however, only stayed the required 5 years and then sold their land to move to larger towns, most often the Twin Cities. And in that way, the settlements throughout North Dakota failed. The land was poor for farming, and the isolation of homesteading prevented observant Jews of religious and social needs that a larger faith community, such as one in the Twin Cities, could offer. I wanted to share the words of one of the firsthand accounts that was written by a woman named Ann Rosen about her life on the farm in North Dakota. Her father and his brothers and sisters all emigrated from Romania around 1888, and in her words were, quote, given homesteads in North Dakota. Quote, the houses were built of sticks, straw, and mud, and were whitewashed inside and out. They had wooden floors. I remember how the houses glistened in the sun miles away. Reindeer ran rampant, and there were fowl of every kind, wild geese, ducks, prairie chickens, and my brothers hunted to their heart's delight. There were also wild animals, wolves, foxes, badgers, which sounded like a crying baby at night. The wolves would come up to the house, and we would put a light in the window to chase them away. School was open during the summer and fall only. The schoolhouse was about 3 miles from our house, and you had to go up a big hill and then down. In winter, the snow would get so deep that you could be swallowed up if you ventured out, so no one went anywhere during winter months. Many a time a cow would leave the barn and fall into snow over her head, and we would have to pull out with ropes. Snowstorms were so bad at times that a rope had to be strung from the house to the barn in order to guide my father when he was attending the stock. We sold the farm in the year 1907. I remember at night going outside and lying down on the grass and looking up the sky with trillions of bright stars, and we loved the outdoors even then. I wish to recall that when flax was planted on the soil, when it was fully grown and ready to be cut, the entire crop had blue blossoms like a field of purple violets, a beautiful sight. As children, we rode horseback, bareback. While we have larger collections related to synagogues and advocacy groups, a fair bit of the materials that we have in the archives are just smaller family papers. One example of these smaller collections is the Abe Sperling papers. Abe's father, Joseph, came to America in 1904 from Russia. He lived in New York and eventually came to reside in North Minneapolis. Abe himself graduated from North High School in 1923 and went on to the University of Minnesota and became an engineer. During World War II, he enlisted in the Army, serving in China to help build the Burma Road. And here you see we have this wonderful journal of his that he wrote during his service. And there's an envelope for the kit of religious materials for Jewish servicemen given to him in 1943 by the USO and Jewish Welfare Board. And it includes a Jewish calendar notebook and a prayer book in both English and Hebrew. Also in this collection are high school yearbooks, deeds to homes purchase, and employment papers, essentially documents of a well-lived life. In one generation, from fleeing Russia to thriving in North Minneapolis, the Sperlings prospered. While some people such as Abe Sperling were able to find their place in Minnesota, there were certainly obstacles Upper Midwest Jews faced. In 1930, Rabbi C. Davis Matt from Adath Yeshurun Synagogue in Minneapolis wrote, quote, "It goes without saying that whenever economic conditions are not of the best, the surest barometer and the greatest sufferer is the Jew." Like any immigrant community, particularly ethnic or religious minorities, Jewish families throughout the Upper Midwest faced prejudice, coming up against anti-Semitism throughout the years. In 1946, an article titled "Minneapolis, the Curious Twin" was published in Common Ground magazine. In the article, Carrie McWilliams, the writer, asserted that, quote, "Minneapolis is the capital of anti-Semitism in the United States. In almost every walk of life, an iron curtain separates Jews from non-Jews in Minneapolis," unquote. This undoubtedly was not news to Jews in the area. In as late as 1948, they were still excluded from membership in the Minneapolis Automobile Association, the Minneapolis Athletic Club, Kiwanis, Rotary, Lions, and other similar organizations. And peppered throughout the collections in the archives, we see examples of this. Here we have a collection of Harry Goldie's papers. Harry was the first boxing coach at the University of Minnesota in the 1920s, and later was the developer for the Calhoun Beach Club in Minneapolis, which is a multi-use building he hoped would help decrease anti-Semitism in the city, because it included one of the few clubs that welcomed anyone, regardless of ethnicity or sex. In the middle here, we have a letter from a fellow developer written in 1945 that states, quote, "It was intimated to me that you were under considerable pressure for leases to Jewish people. While it should be no concern of mine, I do think that leases to these people will certainly be detrimental to the operation of your property. The proposition must go one way or another, and I think if you let one Jewish family in, you're going to create dissension among your other tenants, which will react very unfavorably to your rental situation." Unquote. One must wonder what the developer must have thought once he realized that Harry himself was Jewish. Undaunted, Harry opened the Calhoun Beach Club in 1946, and the building still stands today, which is known as Vintage Apartments. In this photo here, you see Harry welcoming Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale, two local politicians, to the opening of the club. Another interesting collection we have that touches upon anti-Semitism is related to resorts throughout Minnesota and Wisconsin. As late as the 1940s, it was common to print on promotional materials that hotels and resorts were for, quote, restricted clientele only. This euphemism clearly meant one thing, as evidenced by the letter on the right from a resort in Cass Lake, Minnesota in 1947. The letter states point blank, quote, "In answer to your inquiry about our selection of clientele, we take Gentiles only." This collection is full of letters and brochures that use the term restricted clientele around Minnesota and Wisconsin. Included in the collection are letters from Jewish citizens who wrote back to each establishment, politely noting that containing this hate phrase was violating state law. It's unknown how many of them then changed their publicity. Other obstacles existed as well. Jews could not buy homes in certain sections of Minneapolis, and until the creation of Mount Sinai Hospital, which is another collection we have, Jews had difficulties acquiring hospital residencies. When Mount Sinai opened its doors in 1951, it was the first hospital in the city to hire minorities on its medical staff. Fun trivia fact, since this is Minnesota, Prince was born at Mount Sinai Hospital. It's not a Minnesota history presentation without mentioning Prince somehow. So as years went on, human rights and discrimination laws changed to make Minnesota a more tolerant place. You'll also note here, I just had to put the room rates in 1952. To stay at the hotel on the 4th and 5th floor, you could get a private room for $18, which is interesting. In the late 1940s, Hubert H. Humphrey appointed a Council on Human Relations and proposed ordinances to assure that civil rights and discouraged housing and job discrimination. By the 1970s, Jewish advocacy organizations were better poised to help combat discrimination more thoroughly and publicly. This is documented in one of our largest collections, the records from the Jewish Community Relations Council. The Jewish Community Relations Council serves as the public relations voice of the Jewish community to fight against anti-Semitism and safeguard religious freedom. They assist Jewish organizations with issues like on the left, when B'nai B'rith in Minneapolis received a mailer reply filled with KKK literature, or on the right, when Mount Zion Temple in St. Paul was defaced with swastikas in 1978. In the 1970s and 80s, the JCRC, along with many other Jewish community activists, protested the Soviet Union's treatment of Jews. The flyer on the left there states, in the United States, you have to commit a crime to get sent to prison. In the Soviet Union, all you have to do is study Hebrew. Jews throughout the Soviet Union at the time could be jailed for teaching Hebrew, practicing their religion, or even applying to emigrate. The Soviet Jewry movement, organized by the JCRC, aimed to educate and mobilize the local Jewish community, sustain Jewish life in the USSR, while also doing everything possible to get those Jews out of the Soviet Union who wished to leave. By 2001, somewhere around 6,000 Soviet Jews had settled in Minnesota. Jewish social advocacy groups at this time were stronger and more able to serve incoming immigrants. as once again, like generations before, they looked to establish themselves in a new place. So finally, I just wanted to do a quick deep dive into one really fun collection that we have where the Minnesota Jewish community can claim a first. A few years ago, a new collection came here to the archives. It was a smaller collection, just 3 boxes, but it was brimming with beautiful photographs, publicity brochures, scrapbook pages, and clippings telling a story that I had never heard before. That of Jack 𝘔𝘦𝘠, who is a local Jewish businessman. And he was the first person to train guide dogs in America. Today, his place in the history of guide dog training tends to be overshadowed by the more well-known Seeing Eye School, which is located in Morristown, New Jersey. Seeing Eye is more often attributed as the pioneering first in this work, despite opening 3 years after 𝘔𝘦𝘠 started training. Jack began training animals at his family's cattle ranch in South Dakota. It was allegedly an accident on a horse that first planted this seed in his mind to train dogs. Like many apocryphal stories, the details vary, but it occurred either while Jack was visiting his father's ranch in Idaho or while he was in South Dakota. Regardless, he was alone on the prairie when his horse took a tumble and he was thrown off. The horse ran and left Jack with only his dog. It was getting dark, he was miles away from home, and Jack's leg was broken. He yelled to his dog to run and get help. Hours later, the dog returned with people who were able to eventually get Jack to a hospital. This incident left Jack with a lifelong limp, but also with admiration for dogs and their helpful, intelligent nature. And he wondered how much more could dogs be trained to do? Jack eventually left South Dakota for the Twin Cities. In 1920, he married and had a family, and he began breeding dogs, naming his endeavor LaSalle Kennels. As he was working with the dogs, he began forming an idea about training them and was inspired by work coming out of Germany. While dogs as helpers may date back centuries, the modern guide dog movement began when a training school was opened in Oldenburg, Germany in 1916. Many German soldiers had been blinded after World War I, and dogs, in particular German shepherds, were seen as useful to serve as guides for the blind. And it makes sense that this would interest Jack. He had always had a way with dogs, and he was used to training animals. Most likely, he remembered back when a dog saved his life. So he began to correspond with various people in Germany, eventually making the acquaintance of Lambert Kreimer, who was in charge of the German government school in Munich. With the help of the US Department of State, Jack convinced Kreimer to move to Minnesota to work with him. In 1926, Jack 𝘔𝘦𝘠 began training. Kreimer came to the US with 4 partially trained German Shepherd dogs, and with Jack, completed their training at LaSalle Kennels. In 1927, their first trained guide dog, Lux of LaSalle, was presented to Senator Thomas D. Schall. It's unclear how Jack knew Senator Schall, how they initially met, or how this idea began to give Schall the first guide dog. Thomas D. Schall was a Minnesota politician, and at this point, he was a United States senator. He was not born blind. He was trained as a lawyer, and in 1907, while on recess during a court trial, he went to a cigar stand to light a cigar with an electric lighter. The lighter was connected to the wrong power source, and it exploded in his face. He returned to court somewhat dazed, but finished arguing his case. Within days, he had lost his sight. He eventually became a well-known politician, and 20 years later, in 1927, Jack presented Senator Schall with this trained German Shepherd guide dog, the very first of its kind in the United States. The first public mention of Senator Schall with Lux that I could find was in October 1927 in the Minneapolis Tribune newspaper. Quote, "Schall visits Loop District with new dog," the headline reads. The dog, which was named Arter at this point, he was not yet called Lux. He was lauded as helpful in navigating Schall throughout the streets. Quote, "At present, Archer understands only German commands, and Senator Schall has been furnished with a list of words to use when addressing his dog." Senator Schall and Lux became well known across the United States as the idea of guide dogs for the blind spread. Over time, 𝘱 and Lux would even change laws, first to allow guide dogs into the Senate building, and then later 𝘱 worked on a bill to allow guide dogs on public transportation. Kreimer and Sinekin continued to train and breed dogs. They specifically focused on German Shepherds, which were seen by Germans as the superior breed for guide dog work. Their breed, known as the LaSalle strain, is still recognized by the American Kennel Club Association. Kreimer eventually was recalled by the German government a few years after his arrival, but by then, Jack was well versed in training dogs. A second trained guide dog was presented in 1928 to Colonel F.R. Fitzpatrick, a U.S. Marshal in Salina, Kansas, who was blinded World War I veteran. The third dog was Olmo of LaSalle, who was trained for A.W. Christensen in Los Angeles. Olmo would later become somewhat famous, as Christensen would go on to write a book about him and his guide dog, titled My Eyes Have a Cold Nose. Olmo himself was a very good boy. In 1931, he received a medal when he saved his owner from a fire in Los Angeles. But it was Lux of LaSalle, Senator 𝘱's guide dog, who would become the most well-known, garnering much press with Senator 𝘱. A letter dated March 28, 1933 would bring that era to the end. 𝘱 writes, "My dear Mr. Sinekin, Lux, my faithful friend, my patient guide, is gone. Words will not express the loss." Senator 𝘱 had been called away to attend a funeral and thought it rude to bring his guide dog to the solemn occasion, so he left Lux behind. Apparently, Lux was so stressed at the absence of his owner that he refused to eat, and he died before the senator could return. The letter goes on, quote, "Lux was so completely mine, and none but the blind will understand the full significance of this statement. Seeing persons, no matter how kindly, grow irked at waiting, but the time was never too long for him. I might tell you of the various useful things he could do, like retrieve anything I'd lose or drop, fetching things for me, guiding me through crowded traffic, but those are not the things I shall miss. It is his devotion, his single-hearted attachment, his companionship, and the unrestrained flood of emotions he used to tell me that out of all the world, I was the one who made his happiness." 𝘱 mentioned he would love another guide dog, but imagined none could take the place of Lux, his guide and companion for 7 years. A somewhat revised version of this letter would actually show up in the remarks on the May 23rd, 1933 in the Congressional Record. Titled "Just a Dog," Senator 𝘱 wrote, quote, "I know it will not be misunderstood for taking space in the columns of the Congressional Record to commemorate so fine an animal, what some might call just a dog. My dog Lux was a national, yea, international figure, and in doing him this honor, I am not acting without precedent. To this day, he might be the only dog eulogized in the Congressional Record." Unfortunately, that's not where the sadness ends. When Lux died in 1933, Jack did not have a trained dog prepared for 𝘱 to take Lux's place. Jack began training for a replacement, but in 1935, Senator 𝘱 was struck by a hit-and-run driver while crossing the street, and he passed away 3 days later. It's hard to imagine that this would have happened if the senator had his guide dog with him at the time. In the early years of the 1920s, 1930s, Jack only trained 7 or 8 dogs a year. By the mid-1930s, Jack's work received publicity and was underwritten by a number of Jewish organizations, making Jack able to train up to 40 dogs a year. In 1937, Jack was approached by Bishop Scheel of the Catholic Archdiocese of Chicago. Through his Catholic youth organization, he wanted to help blind youth and heard about Jack's work. Together, they formed the Master Eye Foundation as a nonprofit corporation under the laws of Illinois. The bishop paid for the cost of some 30 dogs a year to be trained by Jack at LaSalle Kennels in Minnesota from 1937 through 1949. By 1949, this agreement was terminated because Bishop Scheel wanted the entire operation moved to Chicago, and Jack wouldn't leave Minnesota. Master's Eye Foundation leadership was returned to Minnesota, and then on financial support from an active board, they kept on working. What was most notable, in my opinion, about the work that Jack and Master's Eye Foundation did was that they supplied training guide dogs free of cost. Quote, "This service is rendered without cost or expense to the blind person." Master's Eye was not a business venture looking to make a profit. By the 1960s, a brochure noted that Sinekin was the designated director or training, but he received no salary. The only salaried individual on the Master's Eye payroll was a half-time stenographer. Money raised went to funding the direct cost of bringing the blind candidate to Minneapolis for the necessary period of instruction, which was usually about 3 weeks, and the cost of meals and housing during that training period. In total, at that time, it cost an average of $1,700 to breed, raise, and train a purebred German Shepherd dog to become a suitable guide dog for a blind companion. Further notable, the dogs were furnished to candidates without regard to race, religion, or age. One publicity brochure said, quote, "In the past period of over 40 years, nearly 1,100 Master Eye guide dogs have been released to blind persons, embracing ages from 12 to 73, both men and women, boys and girls, persons of many races, creed, and all skin colors, since the records show that releases of dogs to Negroes, whites, Indians, persons of Oriental extraction, Mexican, South American, etc. Whoever needed a dog could apply." Another pamphlet noted, quote, "Some felt that the young boys and girls, for example, as well as men and women past middle age, could not respond well, and that the dogs themselves would not work competently with either inexperienced youth or with older people with fixed habits. Yet Master's Eye and Jack worked with both old and young." And this practice was in place from the beginning. Further examples of this include a 1941 article which noted that the Blind Service Organization was sending a, quote, "Catholic, a Protestant, a Jew, and a Negro for training." An example of the international reach, this 1946 article describes Carlos Calejo from Mexico, who was trained with the Master's Eye dog. And then back in 1935, one African-American young girl, Geraldine Lawhorn, was the first known both blind and deaf person in the United States to be trained with a guide dog, again from Jack. Geraldine went on to study at the American Conservatory of Music in Chicago and became a known performer and the first blind deaf African-American to earn a college degree. Master's Eye Foundation continued to train dogs here in Minnesota for many years, eventually folding. And when Jack died in 1983, the local newspaper headlines all lauded him as the first person to train guide dogs for the blind. The article estimated that he had personally trained more than 3,000 dogs since 1926. And just think of how many lives that he was able to drastically change with these guide dogs. But before this collection came here to the archives, I did not know of his work. In terms of the legacy of who is the first to train guide dogs in the United States, I came across many articles that list the Seeing Eye in New Jersey as the first and oldest guide dog school, even though they were founded in 1929 and Jack began in 1926. Jack's story is not told at length in publications on the history of guide dogs, if he's even mentioned at all. The story of the Seeing Eye being the first has been perpetuated for a long time. Perhaps one reason of this is that Master's Eye really focused his activity in the Midwest, whereas Seeing Eye was located on the East Coast, which is an area that gets far more, shall we say, attention. Furthermore, the Seeing Eye still exists as an organization, and they have their own archives documenting this history. The writers of the history of guide dogs drew from the materials that they had to tell the story, and the materials telling Jack's story weren't readily available until we got them in the archives. And part of what we have and don't have about Jack's story is because in 1933, the home of the Sinekins in Wayzata was burned down, taking with it many of those early records of LaSalle Kennel and Master's Eye. Some of the story is simply gone. The 3 boxes we have in the archives, as I mentioned, only came a few years ago. And hopefully now that these materials are here and available to researchers, this piece of history may get more attention. So that's just a few of the collections that we have in the archives, some of which were collected when the materials were still part of the Jewish Historical Society, and some of which have come since the archives broke off. And I hope this has given you a little bit more understanding about the history of Jewish communities in the Upper Midwest, and it really gives a peek into the work that we do here in the Twin Cities. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the two organizations of the Jewish Historical Society of the Upper Midwest and the archives really continue to work together as our shared goals of preserving local Jewish history align. And I am happy to answer any questions. I know that was a lot.
Thank you so much. And so I may just start with a question in the chat. We have one from Robbie, and she says, what, if any, influence about the guide dog activities on the Jewish community in the Upper Midwest? She's asking about the influence.
That part I don't know. I don't know how. So in the early years that Jack was doing his work, he was underwritten by a couple local Jewish organizations, but I don't know what the Jewish community thought of the work that he did. And one thing that I'm particularly interested in, especially when you look at the work that he did in allowing anyone, regardless of background, to have a guide dog. I always wonder, why did he do that? How much of that was informed by his faith and his understanding of Jewish values, and how much of it was, you know, other things? I'll never know the answer to that, but that's something that I always think about. Another part that I didn't touch upon was the fact that Jack Sinekin had, in his early years, he worked for a company called Cinderella Cosmetics. And this was during Prohibition. And he got caught selling off some of the alcohol that they had to create perfumes to people. And he ended up going to jail. It seems like he was always really ashamed of that part of his story, and that happened before he trained the guide dogs. So knowing that, I wonder how much the local Jewish community was proud of the work that he was doing, how much they knew about the fact that he went to jail. I think enough time has passed that we now don't think too much about people during Prohibition selling liquor. But definitely during the time, it was something that was seen as shameful by the family.
Okay. And we have a member asking if any exhibits showing your materials, if you have any.
Yeah, so the Jewish Historical Society doesn't currently have an exhibit space. They used to have a space with the at the Minneapolis Jewish Community Center, but they do curate spaces in other places around the community. For example, in synagogues and other spaces. We are, however, looking to, fingers crossed, get a purpose-built exhibit space. So one thing that the Jewish Historical Society has a lot of is artifacts. And at present, they are stored and they are not all visible to the community. So, you know, call us back in 5 years. Hopefully we will have a space to show some of the really fantastic things. One of my favorite things, artifact-wise, that they have is a Hebrew typewriter, which I think I just found it so cool.
Yeah, I guess they would need one. I didn't even think of that, but yeah, no, very interesting. Any questions from our audience?
I think Marilyn.
Okay, Marilyn, let's see.
Unmute.
You're gonna have to unmute, Marilyn. Just a moment. We'll give her a moment.
While she's, do
Mm.
you, can you
Okay,
unmute?
does anyone else have a question?
There
Oh,
you
no,
go.
there she goes.
I think I have it now. Am I
Yeah.
unmuted?
Yep.
You're good, Marilyn.
I wanted to talk about the anti-Semitism. With today's world, does anything happen to where the artifacts are stored? Any anti-Semitic problems that you're facing because of what's happening now at the synagogues in Minneapolis?
Yeah, so anti-Semitism comes in waves, right? And I would say in the last 5 years, things have shifted a little bit. And in terms of the Jewish Historical Society and the archives, one example of this is we put together an exhibit that was called A Campus Divided, talking about anti-Semitism, racism at the University of Minnesota. And it was a very public event and exhibit. And it resulted in conversations about renaming buildings at the University of Minnesota, because it was found that some of these leaders who had buildings named after them were essentially surveilling Jewish students because they were seen as communists and were really interested in segregated housing. So this very public exhibit, at the very end of this exhibit, we had a Post-it note wall where people who saw the exhibit could put their thoughts and reflections. By the end of the exhibit, it was up for like 3 months. There was over 500 Post-it notes. And every single day I had to go down there and make sure that there wasn't anything left. I mean, I was fine with people saying negative things about the exhibit, but if it ever kind of crossed that line about being anti-Semitic or racist, I had to take those Post-it notes down. Ended up, since there was over 500 Post-it notes, I think I only took down about 4. But there was conversation about, this exhibit is so great. Can it travel? Can it go somewhere else on campus? And I said, yes, but I'm happy, but someone needs to watch it. I don't want it to go in a space where there isn't someone looking every single day to see if swastikas are written all over the panels. Unfortunately, the exhibit did not end up traveling, but we did create an online version of it.
Was there any intermarriage between the German and the Russian population over the years?
I am sure there was, but from the work that I've done, what it seemed like was very early on, there was a separation because of culture, because of language. Immediately, Eastern European Jews started their own synagogues in separate areas of St. Paul. I'm sure there was, especially over time, intermarriage, but it seems like in those early years, there was a little bit of kind of standoffishness of German Jews, kind of afraid of like, oh, like, yes, they're Jewish, but, they're a little backwards and we're not backwards like that. So yeah, I don't know if and when intermarriage happened. I'm sure it did, but I don't have evidence of that.
Yeah, well, I guess each culture does their religious observance in their own special way.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
Alice, you have a question?
Yeah. Well, comment on that part. It was the next generation that intermarried. I'm the child of a German Jewish mother and a Russian Jewish father, and there was conflict. It was almost like an interfaith marriage. At the time, it was in the 1940s, and then, after that, it was not so unusual. So it was the next generation that would intermarry. I'm just interested in, well, a couple of things, just as an aside. The pronunciation of the word, you say archival, is that it's archival and not archival?
So it is kind of tomato. If you talk to archivists, they will say archival, but I find some other people say archival. Usually when people say archival, they're talking about stuff. So it's tomato. I prefer archival.
Okay. Interesting. Hadn't heard it. And yes, and then the last thing, which just to sort of confirm, which Jessica had talked about, this such a parallel between what happened in the Upper Midwest and what happened here. The influx of the German Jews first, the Russian Eastern European Orthodox Yiddish-speaking Jews later, the ones that, the German Jews that were the shopkeepers and had money to invest in starting businesses, and the Russian Jews who here were farmers. And fortunately here, the land is pretty good for farming. So they were able to be successful, but definitely a parallel in all of that. So that's interesting.
And another thing that I find interesting, so if you've ever been to Minnesota and you know about the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, right now they kind of blend together, but back in the day, they were very distinct and different. St. Paul was older, had a lot more German immigrants, and the Jews that fared in St. Paul, they fared pretty well. The Jews that went to Minneapolis, Minneapolis had a lot more Swedish, Scandinavian immigrants who didn't really have a lot of experience with Jews. And so that's why you see this kind of story of Minneapolis Jews having a little bit more difficult time with anti-Semitism, because the people that lived in Minneapolis were slightly different. Also, to this day, there exists a bit of divide between St. Paul Jews and Minneapolis Jews, as though travel between the two areas is, you know, it's a 20-minute drive, but still it's like, oh gosh, I got to go all the way over there. So yeah, that's a different kind of intermarriage.
We have east-west in the county like that.
What industries did the people, what did they do besides farming? What else? Did they open up shops? I mean, what else beside that? And what about education? How did they finally educate everybody? And what did the children become? I mean, what was offered to them, and what did they aspire to? Did they go to high school? I mean,
so one of the an exhibit, gosh, COVID has ruined my memory. I want to say 4 years ago, the Jewish Historical Society did a really great exhibit talking about scrap metal businesses, because that was a very large industry that Jews became really influential in, starting with collecting, you know, rags and junk, and then making them into these very large successful businesses that still exist to this day. So you have kind of junk scrap metal, but you also have furriers. You've got any sort of shop you can imagine. And then in terms of education, again, the divide of Minneapolis and St. Paul, both cities had their own Talmud Torahs. And so there's a Talmud Torah that started with the Jewish Education Center, which became the St. Paul JCC, and then kind of branched off and did their own thing. And both Talmud Torahs still exist. So you have this really strong focus, particularly starting in the 1920s, 1930s, on how are we educating our children.
Did they go to public school too?
Yes.
Okay.
And we still have Jewish day schools here, but yeah.
It's very fascinating. I wonder how life was since when they first came over. How did they do kosher? How they didn't have all the facilities to make things kosher. How did they do that?
Yeah, so I think it was in my third slide, there was an image of a book that was called "And Prairie Dogs Weren't Kosher," which I still think is the best title of a book ever. And that book came from an exhibit that the Jewish Historical Society did that was with the Minnesota History Center. And they talked about, you know, prairie dogs weren't kosher. When you are out in the Dakotas, you know, how do you keep kosher? And you did have traveling rabbis, you did have people that would go around who were trained in ritual slaughter and would go from area to area. But this is another reason why you see a lot of people who homesteaded in the Dakotas leaving the area, right? You don't, if you want your children to be educated and part of a Jewish community, and there's only one other Jewish family that's, 20 miles away, that's why you see some people leaving and coming to a place like the Twin Cities.
I have one last question.
Mhm.
In Judaism there, is it Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform?
In the Twin Cities, yes.
Only in both cities, okay.
Mhm. Yeah.
And how did they start? I mean, because I'm sure everybody was Orthodox at the beginning.
Yeah, so Mount Zion Temple, which I mentioned, is the very first congregation in Minnesota, started in St. Paul, and they very early transitioned to conservative reform. And then you have the Eastern European immigrants really kind of staying strong to Orthodox. Some transfer or transitioned into conservative, but we still have Orthodox communities here in St. Paul and Minneapolis.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much. You're just a wonderful, you've given us a whole new way to think about Judaism. It was such a small, group of people, and I think we've really made a great impression on our country and what we have done and achieved.
That's a great point, Marilyn. Thank you.
In spite of anti-Semitism.
Any other questions before we let Kate go? Let's see.
Jean,
Thank you
Jean?
again.
she's trying to turn off her mute.
Yes.
There she is.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Are there many early records of the East European minutes written in Yiddish from the synagogues?
Yes,
You have a collection?
We have a number of materials from synagogues that are in Yiddish. We also have letters that are written in Yiddish. I cannot read Yiddish, which is very unfortunate. I did just get a brand new collection that was donated to me on Friday that is in Yiddish. And I have someone at the university who's very excited, who reads Yiddish. He's going to come over. But it is a scrapbook that was created by people who were in a displaced persons camp, and they had a Yiddish theater in the camp. They
Wow.
eventually come here to St. Paul. They join Temple of Aaron and establish themselves here after the war. But because it's in Yiddish, I can't read it. And so I'm really excited to have him come over and tell me all about this Yiddish theater group who started in a displaced persons camp. I think it's a really kind of unique scrapbook I'm really excited about.
Do you know when the Anti-Defamation League was established in the Twin City area? Since you said Minneapolis was the capital of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, so they started in the 1930s. There was a group called the Silver Shirts who were really anti-Semitic here, very active in Minneapolis. And so there was this need that arose with Anti-Defamation League and the Jewish Community Relations Council. What I will say is that this 1946 article by Carrie McWilliams that calls Minneapolis the capital of anti-Semitism, while I don't doubt that there was anti-Semitism, I really do wonder, he doesn't cite why he thinks that Minneapolis is the worst. A friend of mine, Laura Weber, she's a local Jewish historian, and she's about to publish an article where she really dug into this. It's like, was it the worst? Was Minneapolis really the most anti-Semitic place in the United States? Because Carrie McWilliams, he just says it. He doesn't do anything to back it up. But since then, people constantly quote that, oh, it's the capital, it's the capital. So I'll be really interested to hear, is that true? I'm excited to hear her research.
I want to ask you about the Ku Klux Klan, which was in the South. Was there a group similar to that? And not that they went out and burned crosses and things, but was there a Ku Klux Klan there?
Yep, absolutely. Wisconsin is actually one of the biggest hotbeds for KKK members, and you definitely see it here in Minnesota as well.
Hmm. Are they still there?
Yes, yeah, we actually have a fair amount of materials that were collected during the 1980s of hate mail that the KKK would send out to local organizations. And I hate to use the word enjoy, but I enjoy bringing those materials out when I'm working with the students at the university, because they have this idea that anti-Semitism is a thing that happened way back and is no longer, that present. And so I'll bring out materials from the 80s and from the 90s. And it's enlightening to them of like, oh, this persists.
Well, because here in New Jersey, we were one of the largest KKK organizations.
Oh, interesting.
And they're still active today. And so I guess it's everywhere.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yes. I don't know what. I think I always say when Cain slew his brother Abel in the Bible for power, nothing has ever changed. Power and money. So, but thank you so much. It was.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And well, this is it for us. Thank you so much, Kate, for helping us learn more about the Upper Midwest. It was very insightful. I loved also seeing the parallels. I said earlier, the homesteads were always near and dear. It's something so interesting that really connects to us. And we really appreciate your efforts here today. And I want to thank everyone who signed up for this series. I'm really appreciative of you. This was the first time us doing it, and I'm excited to do more in the future. And
Please.
okay, of course. And I hope to see people at the Rabbi Sally Priesand exhibit. Once again, it's opening March 13th, and we'll be giving tours as well after it. And it should be a great time. Rabbi Sally Priesand has a deep history within us at the museum, and we would love to share more of her efforts, who actually got her training in Michigan, so Midwest. And great connection. And so thank you so much, Kate, for everything.
Thanks for having me.
Everyone be well, be safe, be healthy. Have a great day.